So we're recording. Dee Dee, do you want to advance the slide? Okay, I'm just going to go over today's topics, and I'll give you a little reason why we chose some of these topics. We've been getting a few questions, not just because of the pandemic, some definitely due to the pandemic, but these have been recent ones. And for many of you, you probably know we're doing a Sped Ed Connect tomorrow, and there's going to be other questions that will be addressed on that. So we thought we would stay away from them and go ahead with these topics. Third grade reading guarantee questions, preschool evaluations, preschool goals, prior written notice during the pandemic, because we have been getting some questions about this, and definitely about progress reports during the pandemic, scholarship evaluation and responsibility, and summary of performance. I know most people on here will know what the summary of performance is, but due to the online learning and that, there have been some questions about if you can't reach the student. So I'll let Dee Dee take it away then.
Okay, thanks, Helen. So a couple of questions have arisen about the third grade reading guarantee. As we all know, we have an exemption from any testing this year, but we've been asked several times if districts should do anything about students who they had anticipated exempting from the third grade reading guarantee, and if there would be any kind of reconciliation for those students in the fourth grade having to pass the third grade reading guarantee. We don't expect a requirement in fourth grade. Obviously, you know, the provision of waiving testing should be exactly that, a provision. But even if that were to happen, you would simply exempt those students at that time. What we are suggesting, however, is that if you have IEP meetings at this time of the year where you had anticipated you would exempt a student, that you just go ahead and document that in the PR01. You can simply explain that testing was waived for the 2019-2020 school year, but that the team had determined that the child would be exempted from the consequences of the third grade reading guarantee. That way it's documented. It's not a bad idea to have that documented in the student's record. So we would simply suggest that you do that. Another question that we've gotten a couple of times here over the last few weeks concerns read aloud or text-to-speech accommodations being allowed under the third grade reading guarantee. And, you know, any accommodation is allowable for testing as long as it's permitted by the vendor. And certain vendors do have exclusions of what kind of accommodations are allowed, and you have to abide by those. The other thing that sometimes is confusing, and it seems so simple, but certainly sometimes people get hung up thinking about this, is when students are given a reading assessment, they're measuring two different things. So they're measuring comprehension, and if you're simply measuring a student's comprehension of, do they understand the content, can they answer questions about the content that has been presented, then having a read aloud makes sense if their area of struggle is actually reading the words. It makes sense to provide that accommodation so that you're removing that barrier. But there's also part of the assessment that is actually measuring the student's ability to read and decode words. It doesn't make sense to have an accommodation for a read aloud during that, because then you can't authentically and accurately determine whether or not the student can read and decode words. And the same is true for math. You know, when you think about you're measuring their conceptual understanding, and so it's fine to use a calculator, but if you're measuring whether or not they can actually perform the calculation, then obviously a calculator would be an unfair advantage. So that same theory is true for reading. We also were asked about text-to-speech being permitted. And again, we go back to if it is permissible by the vendor. Quite honestly, for most of the reading assessments, to our knowledge, there's not a ton of writing involved. We think about that more for a writing exam where there's an extended response, but typically for the reading assessments, there's not a ton of writing. And the same would be true for a scribe. And we say those are very interchangeable. If it would be acceptable to have a scribe, then it should be acceptable to have text to speech, because all that is a virtual scribe. So if it's allowable, then either one of those would be acceptable. Okay, and as we talk through these questions, if something pops up that needs clarification, you are welcome to unmute yourself, or you can type something in the chat box, and we will try to monitor that and stop and discuss as we need to. We've also gotten several questions around preschool, particularly around evaluations. We know that there are evaluations that were begun that were not able to be completed for preschoolers who are transitioning. We also know that there were evaluations who maybe weren't even able to be started at the time of closure. So the first question about unfinished evaluations for preschoolers who currently have a DD category, but the team suspected that the student might not in fact qualify under a school age category. And so the question arose, should we do a record review now, or should we wait until the fall? And, one of the things that we would say, and I'm going to quote directly Janine, our director, as we've had conversation around this several times. I love the way she puts it, that in special education, we sort of operate from an innocent until proven guilty. That's sort of the approach, that we assume a child does not have a disability until we can solidly prove otherwise. However, once a child has been identified as a student with a disability, then we sort of take the opposite approach. We assume that they continue to qualify until we solidly prove that they do not. So our concern about doing a record view now, without waiting until fall, when you could do some observation, you could do some face-to-face testing, would be that we'd be making a decision saying that a child no longer has a disability without the benefit of that full and comprehensive evaluation if we simply did a record review. So again, we're not saying that you can't do that, but we'd be very cautious about proceeding with that, because we want to give the child every benefit, again, of that full and comprehensive evaluation. And we know that at that young age, kids change so rapidly that we'd be very concerned to just do a record review and decide that a child was no longer qualifying. And the second question that has popped up several times is, should we start the preschool to K evaluations now, or should we wait until fall? And again, we would say here that you can definitely start putting these evaluations together. The U.S. Department of Education has actually recommended that districts do what they're able to do now and not wait for fall to do everything. But we do want to throw out a couple of things that we'd like you to consider, that you will definitely want to ensure that you reflect the child's needs in the summer, or excuse me, in the school environment, as you know them to be. What you know about the child while they were in school, what you know and was observed and you have record of. But then you are also going to want to indicate what the child's needs look like in this current reality, because it does have bearing. We all suspect that we may very well be transitioning back to some type of blended format. We don't think that it's going to be a light switch where suddenly we're all going to be back in our brick and mortar settings full time. So I definitely think that the child's needs during this time of virtual learning does have bearing on the evaluation. So we would say be cautious that the team doesn't sort of seek to redefine the disability based on what you're observing right now. We're just simply saying that it is a factor and it should be considered and included. But having said that, that's not wholly indicative of the child's disability and needs. It's more like an added layer to what is seen in the classroom, and it would help the team understand any additional implications for online instruction. And I think about evaluations as a whole, even for school-age children, that I think we will see more and more when we look at that implications for instruction, that there will be sort of an added piece to that, because the implications for online instruction may be quite different than what a child needs when they're face-to-face. And so I'm simply saying that it's another layer that we will want to consider and include in that evaluation and have some input on, certainly to help the IEP team think about the best ways to facilitate learning for a child if there continues to be some distance in virtual learning. Okay, another question that we've gotten really centers around when it's okay to add academic goals on an IEP if the child really only has a related service. And specifically thinking about if a child only has a speech and language impairment, is it appropriate to have academic goals on there? Um, and so one of the things that we consider is, um, if you're thinking about there being only a speech and language impairment, that really wouldn't constitute academic needs. It's not a cognitive disability. Um, and I guess there could certainly be an argument that the speech and language impairment is so significant that it impedes the child's understanding and comprehension of academic content. And we certainly can appreciate that. But I definitely think that that would be the exception and not the norm. So yes, in theory, you could add a goal, but I would certainly want to ensure that it's very evident in the profile of the IEP and also in the plop exactly how and why the speech language impairment is causing an academic deficit. And the ETR would need to corroborate this. So I had said to Stacy, our early childhood specialist, that the team would kind of have to sell me on it. So it's not that it's not possible, but again, I would think if there were academic deficits that were popping up that were significant enough to warrant being addressed, that you might be looking at an SLD category as opposed to speech and language. And so again, if the language impairment is really causing a significant deficit in the child's ability to comprehend content, then again, yes, it is possible, but it needs to be very clear, and that really needs to be, again, substantiated by what's in the ETR. Okay, I am going to turn it over to Helen, and she's going to talk us through some PRO1 considerations.
Okay, thank you, Dee Dee. Yes, PRO1 questions. I have been getting some questions about containing the language of COVID-19 in your PRO1s. Well, definitely you'll want to. And with PRO1s, we shouldn't be sending just a blanket statement of the pandemic as a district blanket statement. We want to be using that individually with all students that are on IEPs. And one thing I want to say is you need to remember that the PRO1 is the district's friend, more or less, and that you want to put in about the COVID-19 because the district did not close the schools. The state close the schools with shelter in place and no school. So you want to include language about COVID-19 in your PR1s because that will be a protection for the district. Like I said, you are not denying the student fate by not having the school open. You are actually following the state guidelines that schools must be closed. So I just wanted to say if there were any questions about PR1s, because I did get some that teachers were kind of fearful that if they put something about the pandemic in a PR1, that would maybe automatically suggest that there could be compensatory education, and that's not so. I mean, basically, the COVID-19 needs to be documented in not only your PR1s, but if you're even writing in an IEP, I would be talking about PR1 in your profile about COVID-19. So Dee Dee, you can jump in if you have anything extra there. But
the only thing I would add is Helen and I have talked with a lot of districts about, again, when you're thinking about FAPE and what the district is doing, it is certainly in your best interest in the PR01 to document what you are providing, because we know that there may be some adjustments for what is being addressed in a child's IEP. The reality is there may be certain things that you are not able to work on, or you are working on in a different way. And so it is critical that you document those things. And certainly if there is a service that the district is unable to provide, it is important that you do document what you are not providing and why, but it's equally important that you document what you are providing and the methods and the attempts that you are making to supplement or address a need in an alternate way if there is something that you are not able to provide as it is written in the IEP.
yes, and another thing, we want to prioritize some of our needs also, because there may be some things, just like Dee Dee said, that, and right away what comes to my mind is physical therapy. There are often portions of physical therapy that are not going to be able to be done without hands-on, but prioritize, definitely have discussions with parents, phone calls, talk about their needs, plus also with the PRO1s, you may have parents, or we have heard that there are parents that are overwhelmed and do not want services at this time. You need to document that, because that doesn't automatically guarantee that they are going to get compensatory services because they refuse services at this time. And I hate to be talking about compensatory services just because we're all going through this pandemic, families, etc., and they may be refusing services at this time just because they are so overwhelmed. They may not just have one student at home, but several. Maybe they're not even able to work from home. So it is quite an overwhelming situation. But I also want to just say for the district, you should, be putting that in your PR1s and definitely keeping some data on when you are contacting parents. And I'll go into that a little bit further with the progress reports, but you want to be able to show that you have made attempts if there are parents definitely that you cannot reach via email, online email, snail mail, or phone calls, because we know there are families out there that people have not been able to reach. Any questions there? Okay, Dee Dee.
That's great, Helen. And I would just add one thing before we move on to the next question. Helen brought up a good point that, there's a lot of anxiety and concern right now around compensatory services. And we actually shared at a meeting with the state last week, and they really seem to agree wholeheartedly. And we've also had legal counsel express the same sentiment, that we really urge districts to sort of avoid the language of saying compensatory services. We would rather hear something creative like, COVID impact support services or recovery services. And the reason for that is, when we think about compensatory services and what that means, compensatory services really indicate that's sort of a legal term that is used when there's been a denial of FAPE by
Right.
a district. And so we think about compensatory in terms of a district's been ordered by a court to provide something because they did something wrong. And as Helen mentioned earlier, that's not the case here. Districts are making that good faith effort, doing their due diligence to provide FAPE. FAPE just looks different right now than what it looked like 4 months ago. But that doesn't mean that a district is not providing it. And so we really want to stay away from that terminology, because it does have such a negative connotation. And again, you can call it whatever you want, but we'd like you to be creative in calling it something that is more proactive and positive, that shows that, the district is, again, taking a proactive stance to try to provide some recovery services and support for students. But it is not the same as compensatory as what you would be providing if you had denied FAPE to a student. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, thank you, Dee Dee. And we have talked, and any of you that have been on any of the case webinars and whatnot, that IDEA was not written for a pandemic. So as long as you're making a good faith effort, and definitely, like Dee Dee said, try to stay away from that word compensatory, because as long as you're making a good faith effort, you did not close the schools, the state closed the schools. I think that's all I have for that part. Anything else there, Dee Dee?
Nope, go ahead, Helen.
Okay, progress reports. I have gotten a lot of questions about progress reports and how you're going to document or explain goals that are not able to be addressed or worked on. And like we said, even with the PRO1, you're going to, in your progress reports, you're going to PRO1 too, but you're going to document what, when the schools close, what data you had at that time, and then what data you've been able to gather through online backpacks, whatever, phone calls, conversations with parents, whatever you have been able to provide, and what data you have gathered at this point. Now, there may be certain goals, like we said before, even when you are in school, that maybe the student hasn't totally accomplished, and that may continue next year. But you do want to document and explain. And I was asked, should we talk about COVID-19 in the progress report? Yes, you should, because COVID-19 has impacted some of the progress or some of the service delivery for students that are no longer in a brick and mortar school. So you definitely should talk about COVID-19 and also talk about where the student was at the closing of school, and go on with the documentation that you have now on goals that you have prioritized. On goals that maybe the student is not making adequate progress, you talk about that, same as you would when a kid is in, a student is in school during regular, normal school day with in brick and mortar, where possibly there hasn't been adequate progress. Now, I know when schools closed, we were probably going into the fourth quarter, so some of you would have been doing interims. You still had to do those interims, and some of you, and then all of you would be doing the final progress report for the end of the year. But you do need to, like I said, address those goals, explain why some of those goals, or why there might not have been progress on some of those goals, and you do need to include COVID-19, because that has had an impact. And I don't think I have a whole lot more on that. The question specifically came from a district because, once again, the teachers were concerned about not putting COVID-19 in on the progress reports. And another thing I want to say, and I don't want to get caught up in, you know, are we going to go to court over certain things? The more documentation you have, the better you are going to be in the future if something like that arises. We always say document, 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 and you want to do that. And you also want to document dates and times, because if perchance you ended up in a court situation, those are things they're going to ask for. And we also, when we were on our OEC meeting, we have to remember that, like I said before, this is a pandemic. This is nothing we have gone through in our lifetime. And this is not districts or schools closing to deny students access. This was state ordered. And if you would have a court case, you're going to have a hearing officer that is also going to be aware of the situation. So if you were making good faith attempts, documenting your attempts, keeping dates, and how you're trying to reach students, you're going to be in a much better situation. Dee Dee, do you have anything to add there?
That's such a great point, Helen. And I definitely think one of the things Helen and I have talked about is, like Helen said, even during normal operation, before any of this happened, it is acceptable that sometimes you haven't started working on a goal yet with a student for whatever reason. Thinking about high schoolers who change classes, or that you have been working on some sub skills that were needed. And it is always acceptable to indicate on a progress report that there isn't any data because you haven't started working on a goal yet. And that very well could be the case, that you have had limited ability to work on a goal. Obviously our hope is that most goals can be addressed during distance learning, but the reality is as Helen shared earlier, there are some things that you may not be able to work on, or may be able to do so in a very minimal or limited fashion. And again, it's okay to indicate that and why. And but I think, to Helen's point, what is critical is that you keep data on what you were able to do, what you were able to provide. And we would just reiterate that in those circumstances, those instances where you maybe have students who are not responding, or you're not able to get a hold of, that you document in both places, in the PRO1 and on that progress report, all of the attempts that have been made and all of the different ways that the district has attempted to engage the student and provide support and services. That's a critical piece, that you make sure that you document those attempts and everything that's been done, like Helen said, whether it's, all the platforms that you're using, materials you've sent home, everything that you've done. You want to have that paper trail, especially if you have cases where students are not turning in work, or they're not engaging, they're not responding. Then definitely make sure you've got a very good paper trail of your attempts.
And just to add to that, because of the transition position I'm in, I have had some transition coordinators ask me about students that say this was their end quarter, they've been on a job site, the job had to close. That is not, that's not against the employer, the student, or the transition coordinator. And that should be documented, that the student had a job, what they were doing at that time, how they were, how they were interacting on the job. And also the fact that it was closed during this time, no fault of anyone's. And I was also asked about, okay, will they still get credit? Like, they were thinking they will get credit because it was no one's fault that the job had closed, or the situational assessment or the on-site work program had to be shut down because shelter in place. So if anybody has any questions about that, definitely, give me, ask me now or send me some emails, because I know some of the transition situations have been a little difficult for people to address.
Okay, thanks, Helen. That's a really good reminder about some of those very challenging transition situations where kids were out in community-based settings. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Another question that we have had pop up, we get a lot of questions around scholarship, and we do our best, but I'm sure you all have felt frustration at times that scholarship seems to be a moving target, and we don't always have um, the the best guidance around it. Sometimes it's a little bit of a digging and a treasure hunt to find information. But we were asked specifically about if a student is enrolled in a non-public district or non-public setting, and the district of service completed an ETR, then what is the timeline for the district of residence to complete an IEP? Because often the district of residence may not even know that this is taking place, and they might find out when there's days left within a 30-day timeline, which can certainly cause some panic for the district of residence. So we thought we'd stop here and just talk about a couple of things. We have shared this in previous sessions, but it bears repeating because, again, it can be confusing. First of all, thinking about who is responsible for the evaluation. You may already know this, but we'll say it again. It really depends on where the student is currently at the time of the referral. If the child has not been in the district of residence and is already enrolled in the non-public at the time of a referral or a suspicion of disability, then it does fall to the district of service, meaning the district where that non-public is located, and they are responsible for the ETR. However, once that is completed, they will notify the district of residence, or the family can, and the district of residence does need to make an offer of FAPE. It is up to the parent whether or not they choose to enroll in the district of residence and accept that provision of FAPE, or if they are going to continue at the non-public. So first of all, in this case, the child's already in a non-public. The district of service did exactly what they were supposed to, and they completed an ETR. If the child was not yet in the non-public and was affiliated with the district of residence, then the whole kit and caboodle falls on the district of residence. The district of residence is responsible for the initial ETR and any reevaluation, even once the student goes on to a non-public or a scholarship provider. The district of residence would still be responsible for that because they were aware and the child was affiliated with them at the time of the initial referral. But here in this case, the child's already at the non-public. The district of service did what they were supposed to do and completed an ETR. But again, they may or may not notify the district of residence because, and the reason for that is because it is actually, and I'm going to show you, I put this on here just so you could see it. The district of residence has 30 days from the time of the request to complete an IEP. And language right from ODE states that if the child is not enrolled in a public school, but has been identified pursuant to a current evaluation, then per IDEA, the public school district, that means the district of residence, will complete an IEP in 30 days from the date of the request from the applicant. Here's the critical piece. The applicant is the parent or family or guardian, and they must initiate the request. So it is not on, the onus is not on the district of service to make the request. And so that is why you may not hear from them, because it is totally up to the family to initiate that request once they know that their child has been deemed eligible. then it is their responsibility to initiate a request for an IEP from the district of residence. So I hope that's clear and I didn't muddy the waters there.
I don't think you did, Dee Dee. I just wanted to kind of interject why this really kind of came up too, because we had a situation where a parent who does need to initiate the request contacted the school, and the district, and said, you know, like the day before the 30 days after the ETR, that okay, they wanted an IEP written by the district, and the district was like, wait a minute, you know, why didn't I hear about this? This is a day before, like, due. Once the parent requests, then you have 30 days from that point.
Thank you. Yes, great point, Helen. Okay, Helen, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk us through summary of performance.
Okay. The reason I'm bringing up summary of performance, I think most people know what the summary of performance is. It's what you do with students as seniors as part of their exit from school services. You're going to interview students and talk to them, summarize their strengths and needs while exiting the school services, and you're supposed to get direct input, or you would get direct input from the student. You also have the teacher also puts in their input and gives information about what accommodations may be needed in the future. I mean, we leave IDEA, but students do go under ADA, what's their strengths are. And this is beneficial for job situations if students decide to state that they have a disability. And it also works as very good for offices of accessibility at college campuses. Not only do they look at the IEP, but a good written summary of performance can give them a quick insight into the student. What has come up recently is, what if we're unable to reach a student to get their response? Once again, due to COVID-19, or possibility, I had someone tell me that a student was working and they hadn't been able to get in touch with them. You must document your attempts, just like with OLTS, the Ohio Longitudinal Study, that a lot of times when follow-ups come along, it's difficult to reach students. Well, you need to document, same as you would in an IEP, the attempts you have made, not 2 attempts in the same day, different ways of attempting snail mail, email, phone call. And if you cannot reach the student for their input, you will document, the teacher will still do the form, fill out the information, give their input on the student's strengths and needs, and then also have the documentation of attempts to reach the student. Then you will send the summary of performance to the family along with the PRO1, because that PRO1 will note that the student is exiting services from schools. So I think for the most part people understand PRO1s, but since the close of brick and mortar, sometimes just like reaching kids for services, if you have difficulty reaching them to do the summary of performance, if it hadn't been done before the close of school, you still need to complete it. And like I said, document dates that you attempted to reach the student and methods in attempting to reach the student. And then you're okay. And like I said, you still have to fill out the district summary. Okay, any questions there? Okay, Dee Dee, I'm turning it back over to you, I believe.
Okay, thanks, Helen. That's a great point, and I think I would even say exactly what Helen indicated about being so careful about documenting your attempts, and that you tried a variety of methods We say the same thing for an IEP. When you can't get a parent to participate in an IEP or, a record review or reevaluation, whatever the case may be, the same is true for the summary of performance. You would document those attempts, like Helen said. And unfortunately, we have come across situations where, we look at a documentation of attempts for an IEP or for whatever it is, and it's, well, I called 3 times in the same day, or I made a phone call on 3 different days, but that was it. They never went beyond a phone call. And it is really important that you try to sort of exhaust all avenues. So like Helen said, you've got to get creative. You send an email, you send snail mail, you send a certified letter, you do a phone call, carrier pigeon, whatever the case may be. But you certainly want to make sure that you are showing a variety of ways that you attempted to get that contact and get the information or signature or whatever it is that you're after. So that's a good reminder for us. Okay, well, at this time, we have covered all of the questions that we had coming in before today's session. So we will wait just a moment. If there are any questions on the fly that you have or burning things that you would like to talk about with your colleagues and peers who are on with us today, we will give you a second to unmute or utilize the chat box. And we'll kind of wait here for a moment. And if we have nothing else to discuss, then we will wrap up for this morning.
Hi, I had a question about IEPs for the students who we still have to reevaluate for transitioning from preschool to kindergarten, but they currently have preschool IEPs. That was one of the things that our team was wondering how we should handle those IEPs.
Okay, so you're saying that these are your kids who would be transitioning to kindergarten, but you've not been able to do the evaluation yet.
Yes.
Okay. And Stacy and Michelle happen to be on with us today, and they are our early childhood experts. So I'm gonna certainly ask them to weigh in here. But what I would say is that you certainly could go ahead and write the IEP with the information that you have, knowing that that IEP is gonna have to be amended and changed. And again, it is a little different for transition from preschool than it is for school age, and we understand that. So I'm going to ask Stacy or Michelle if they'd like to chime in here and talk about what they've seen others doing in our region.
Thanks, Dee Dee. So just to clarify, you said that you do not have the evaluation completed, but the child's going to need to transition to kindergarten?
Yeah, that's correct. We have a couple who are still developmental delays, so we have to do the ETRs to transition from preschool to kindergarten, but they still have the preschool IEPs, but they'll be transitioning to kindergarten, and we were just wondering how to write their IEPs.
Great. Okay. So ODE had come out with some guidance around specifically around the eligibility with the DD category, and in the guidance that they stated, they are making the statement that they realize that the evaluation may need to wait until the child gets to kindergarten because you cannot complete those observations. And that was the same information that came out in the considerations for students with disabilities on March 27th, when it talked about the fact that if you have to have a face-to-face observation to complete an evaluation, then you cannot complete the evaluation at this time. And as I'm just going to quote Dee Dee again, as they keep going back to, IDEA was not written with any recommendations for how to handle a pandemic. So what keeps coming out of all of our calls with ODE is that the good faith effort to complete things, that flexibility, and also very, very clear communication with parents. And so they continue to say, if you can complete an evaluation, you can complete it. and make sure that it's very clear with the parent that the parent is okay with the process of how you're completing it. If you cannot complete it and you do not feel that you're gaining the right information, then ODE at this point is making the statement that they understand that they cannot get completed until the child is back able to be seen face to face. So I know that is not super clear guidance, but that's what we have at this point. So again, just summarizing, if you have enough information that you can complete an evaluation and write an IEP to transition, you can. If you cannot, that guidance that came out all the way back in March states then you can't complete the evaluation. And we're actually, Michelle and I have a call today with early learning, and I know they're trying to figure out a way in EMIS. Is there something they can come up with a code in EMIS that indicates these transitions are going to look different because of the pandemic situation we're in? So as we find out more information, we'll definitely share that.
So what would we do? Would we just wait for the IEPs then? Because we kind of have a plan already for what we're doing with the evaluation, but the preschool teacher is more curious on like what she should do with their IEPs when they go into kindergarten, because right now, for example, she was saying it's written like their services will be in the preschool classroom. So she just wanted to make sure she was doing the right thing for their IEPs.
And Stacy, I'm going to let you.
Yeah,
go ahead if you had something you wanted to add, Stacy.
I was going to ask you if you had any input on that.
Yeah, so what I was saying earlier, and I understand exactly why you're asking, because although we know that you are going to need to wait in some of those circumstances to complete the evaluation, and that's certainly what we would want you to do, you still have a timeline for an IEP. And unfortunately, as I'm sure most of you know, at this juncture, we do not have any flexibilities yet around timelines. We were all hoping for that, but it has not happened. And so that's why I said, you may still have to write the IEP and know that, and make sure that the family understands that it's going to have to be changed. Because again, it is certainly not an ideal situation, but the reality is you're trying to write an IEP without the evaluation that you need in order to stay compliant with your timelines, but knowing that you are not writing it really for a child who's going to be in preschool again, that it's going to be, transitioning to kindergarten. So I would suggest that you do the best that you can to write it for that transition to kindergarten. And again, as we keep saying, and we've said throughout this morning's session, make sure that you include language in there. In the profile would be a perfect place to do that. There will need to be some changes made to the IEP. That you are writing it based on the information that you have right now, but that there will be some additional components added to the evaluation, and that at that time, the team will, reconvene, whether that's face-to-face or over the phone or whatever the case may be, but that if there are any needed changes, they will be made then. And that really is the best that you can do. And the reality is for whatever reason, there are rare circumstances, rare instances in normal everyday life outside of the pandemic when things like that happen, when an IEP needs to be written and, we weren't able to complete an evaluation because, for whatever reason, a child becomes very medically fragile or something of that nature. And we would suggest the same thing, that you write what you can with the information that you have, and you indicate that, at the time that additional information data becomes available, that the IEP will be changed accordingly. Hope that helps.
That
So
did.
Dee Dee,
Thank
that
you.
kid would continue to qualify under DD, and we would just write the IEP until we can do another evaluation, correct?
I mean, that's what I would say, Stacy, unless you have other thoughts. But yeah, because again, you have to be writing based on the information that you have. And if that's where you're at, and you're not able to complete the evaluation, you can't be guessing, obviously, at an eligibility category, but certainly you can be writing an IEP based on the child's strengths and needs that you know to this point.
I would agree. This is Helen again, and I think that's some of the guidance we have been given. So yeah.
And Stacy and Michelle, anything that you wanted to add there?
No, I just, again, we're going to try to seek some more clarification around that actually today, just because it is a unique situation, because then you have a preschool qualification and a school age IEP, and it'll cause an EMIS issue for sure. So we're trying to get some clarification around that. So thanks for the question, and we will definitely share more guidance as we get it. Thanks, Dee Dee.
And yeah, and we welcome you to follow up with us through email, because again, as Stacy said, they are constantly reaching out to early childhood at the state, early learning, and seeking additional clarification on how we can proceed with some of these things. And we know that there are things that are going to absolutely cause an EMIS flag and an EMIS error. So as we get that information, we're happy to answer those questions and share that. So, please don't hesitate to continue to follow up with us.
And I do want to interject too that, like we always say, this is what we know as of today. And as things change or we go forward, I'm sure Janine will send an email blast out to districts and that too, like we have in the past, if there's something dramatic.
Absolutely. Any other questions that we can address here in our last few moments together? Okay. Well, we thank you all so much for joining us. We know that there are lots of things that you can be doing and need to be doing, and we do definitely appreciate you taking time to join with us this morning. It is shaping up to be a beautiful day outside, and we hope that you all have an opportunity to kind of get outside and enjoy some sunshine. And as we leave, Helen and I do just, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there. We do just want to wish you all well and remind you again to engage in self-care, stay safe, stay well, and do something nice for yourself today.
Yes, and Dee Dee, I just want to interject too, because typically we wouldn't have our next office hours until probably September. However, we have the Sped Ed Connect tomorrow that I hope many of you will be joining. But we had a discussion yesterday with Janine that possibly, depending upon how things go forward, Dee Dee and I might be doing an office hour in the summer, June or whatever, and that would be to update. So we would definitely send out information about that.
Exactly. That's perfect, Helen. So if there's anything critical that we need to get out to you, or that we think you would benefit from having an opportunity to discuss with your colleagues, like Helen said, we'll throw in a summer office hour. For this one time only, you'll get 2 for the price of 1. So, all right, with that, again, we thank you and we wish you all a great day. And also, if we don't talk to you again before fall, we wish you a peaceful and happy summer.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
Thanks.